It all started as a quiet weekend at our lake cabin, the kind of peaceful escape we had been craving after a long stretch of busy weeks. The sun was setting over the water, the smell of pine trees in the air, and for once it felt like life had slowed down. But little did we know, the calm wouldn't last. That evening, a group of HOA enforcers showed up at our property, claiming we were breaking rules that didn't even make sense. At first, it was just words tossed back and forth, but their attitude quickly turned aggressive. They didn't expect anyone to stand up to them, and they definitely didn't know who they were dealing with. My wife, who usually prefers to keep her past private, was with me the whole time. To them, she looked like just another cabin owner enjoying a weekend by the water. What they didn't realize is that she's a former Marine sniper, someone who has faced far bigger challenges than a handful of overzealous HOA enforcers. She stayed calm, collected, and measured, but I could tell she was sizing up the situation with the same sharp instincts that had carried her through the toughest moments of her service. The tension kept building as the HOA enforcers tried to push their authority, ignoring every reasonable word we said. They moved closer, trying to intimidate, but they had no idea they were walking into a situation they couldn't control. The look in my wife's eyes changed, and I knew the moment had come where things were about to turn. What happened next at that lake cabin would shock everyone there, and it was the last thing the HOA enforcers ever expected. The HOA had always been a thorn in our side, but up until that weekend, it was more of an annoyance than anything else. Letters about the color of our mailbox, warnings about the length of our grass, even fines for parking too close to the cabin. It was all part of their game. But showing up unannounced at night in a group with that kind of energy felt different. It wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about power, and they wanted to remind us that they thought they had it. I could see the way they scanned the cabin, pointing at little things that didn't even matter. One of them mentioned a so-called violation about the dock. Another kept insisting we weren't allowed to have our firewood stacked where it was. Their voices grew louder, and they seemed more determined the more we tried to reason with them. It was like they were searching for a fight, convinced they could intimidate us into giving in. My wife leaned against the porch railing, listening, her calm presence almost unsettling compared to the chaos in front of us. To anyone else, she looked relaxed, but I knew that wasn't the case. She was trained to notice details most people missed, the way one man kept shifting his stance, the nervous glances they exchanged, even how their truck was parked at an angle that blocked the path to the road. She had picked up on everything without saying a word. The night air grew heavier, and the lake that had been so peaceful earlier now felt like it was holding its breath. I could sense something was coming, something none of us could walk away from unchanged. And that's when the enforcers made their next move. The enforcers stepped closer, their voices overlapping as if they were trying to drown us out. One of them pulled out a clipboard, waving it around like it was a weapon, claiming he had official documentation, proving we were in violation. But when I asked to see it, he snapped the papers shut and muttered something about confidential HOA records. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about rules at all, it was about control. Meanwhile, my wife stayed quiet, her eyes flicking between each of them, watching their body language more than their words. She had been in situations where silence spoke louder than shouting, and I could tell she was letting them dig their own hole. The way they puffed up their chests, the way they tried to block the porch steps, it was all intimidation. But they had no clue they were putting themselves on the wrong side of someone who had seen real battlefields. I couldn't help but think about how strange it was, this little war over a cabin at the lake. Here we were, supposed to be enjoying a peaceful weekend, but instead the HOA had turned it into a standoff. And behind all of it, I began to wonder if something bigger was going on. Why were they pushing so hard? Why now? Was there someone higher up in the association pulling the strings? As the standoff stretched, I noticed a light flicker on across the water. Another cabin owner had seen what was happening. For a brief moment, I thought the enforcers might back down with witnesses nearby. But instead, their tone grew sharper, their words harsher, like they had already decided they weren't leaving until they got what they wanted. That's when things truly began to spiral. The air around the cabin felt charged, almost electric, as if the whole lake was holding its breath. The enforcers had stopped pretending this was about paperwork or minor violations. Their stance shifted, shoulders squared, voices low but sharp. They weren't there to talk anymore. One of them stepped onto the first porch step, his boots heavy against the wood, making it clear he intended to push his way inside. I moved to block him, my heart pounding, but before I could say a word, my wife's hand brushed lightly against my arm. It was her way of telling me to hold steady. She hadn't spoken much all night, but her silence was louder than anything. The way she stood, calm and unshaken, made even the boldest enforcer hesitate for just a second. The leader of the group broke that silence with a threat disguised as a warning, telling us we could either cooperate or face consequences. His words echoed in the night, but behind them, I could hear the nervous shuffle of his team. They weren't as confident as they wanted to appear. My wife noticed it too. She caught their hesitation, their uneasy glances, and I could see her mentally mapping out every detail: the truck's position, the number of steps between them and us, even the faint reflection of the moon on the water behind them. Across the lake, more cabin lights flicked on. Shadows moved near the windows, neighbors quietly watching, waiting to see how far this confrontation would go. The pressure grew thicker, like the air before a storm. The enforcers finally made their move, stepping in closer, their tone sharp, their patience gone. That was the moment everything collided: the standoff, the silence, the unspoken warning in my wife's eyes, building to the breaking point we all knew was coming. Just as the tension reached its peak and it seemed like the confrontation was about to explode, another sound cut through the night: the crunch of tires rolling over gravel. Every head turned as headlights swept across the trees, stopping right in front of our cabin. A black SUV pulled up, one that didn't belong to any of the neighbors. The HOA enforcers stiffened, exchanging quick glances, like they had been expecting backup. My stomach sank because suddenly it felt like this situation was much bigger than a simple rules dispute. The driver stepped out slowly, wearing a suit instead of work clothes, clearly not a typical HOA volunteer. He didn't introduce himself, didn't carry a clipboard, and he didn't need to. The way the enforcers shifted their posture told me everything. This was the person really pulling the strings. He walked right up without hesitation, scanning the property like it already belonged to him. His presence alone raised the stakes, and the energy shifted from a loud standoff to something colder, calculated. My wife's eyes narrowed, and I knew she was already piecing it together. This wasn't random. This was orchestrated.
But why?
The man finally spoke, his tone smooth but firm, saying the association had concerns about our cabin. His words didn't match his stare, though. There was something else he wanted, something that had nothing to do with firewood, docks, or paint colors. The neighbors across the water hadn't moved, their silhouettes frozen in their windows. They were watching just like us, probably realizing the HOA wasn't acting alone. The enforcers stood behind the suited man like a wall, waiting for a signal. The quiet night felt heavier than ever. This wasn't just about HOA enforcement anymore. This was about control, and we were standing in the middle of something we didn't fully understand. The suited man stepped closer, his voice calm but filled with authority, telling us we had two choices: sign an agreement handing over certain rights to the cabin or face legal action that would make our lives difficult. The HOA enforcers stood behind him, nodding as if they were his personal guard. For a moment, it felt like we were completely cornered. But what he didn't count on was my wife. She finally spoke, her voice steady, carrying the weight of someone who had been in tighter situations than this. She reminded him that intimidation and threats might work on scared homeowners, but they wouldn't work here. Then, with a subtle motion, she revealed that she had already been recording everything from the moment they stepped foot on our property. Every word, every threat, every move, it was all documented. The enforcers froze, their faces draining of confidence. The suited man tried to dismiss it, but my wife was one step ahead. She had already texted the recording to a neighbor across the lake, someone she trusted, ensuring that even if they tried to take the phone, the evidence was safe. At that moment, the neighbors who had been silently watching began stepping outside, porch lights glowing like spotlights on the scene. The HOA's intimidation lost its power in the face of witnesses. The man's calm mask cracked just slightly as he realized the trap had flipped. He signaled his group to retreat, muttering about unfinished business before disappearing into the SUV. The enforcers followed, but not without one last glare that promised this wasn't over. As the taillights faded, the lake grew quiet again. We had won the battle, but the twist was clear. This wasn't just an HOA dispute. Something bigger was brewing, and the cabin was only the beginning. When the last set of headlights disappeared down the gravel road, the air around the cabin finally began to ease. The neighbors who had come outside lingered for a few minutes, asking if we were all right and shaking their heads at what they had just witnessed. It was clear that everyone had known the HOA could be pushy, but no one realized how far they were willing to go until that night. The truth had been dragged into the open, and now people couldn't look away. Inside the cabin, my wife finally let her guard down, sitting quietly by the window with a calm that only comes after a storm. She admitted that part of her had expected something like this for a while. The fines, the constant pressure, the small battles that never seemed to end. What none of us expected was how organized it had become, how someone behind the scenes was using the HOA as a tool for something bigger. That realization left us with more questions than answers, but at least we knew we weren't alone anymore. The next morning, messages started coming in from neighbors. Some offered their support, others wanted copies of the recording, and a few admitted they had been pressured by the same HOA tactics before, but were too afraid to speak out. What had started as an attack on us turned into a wake-up call for the entire community. Looking back on that night by the lake, the lesson was clear. Strength doesn't always come from fighting. It comes from standing your ground, staying calm, and exposing the truth when others try to hide it. The cabin was meant to be our escape, and in a strange way, it still is. It's a reminder that peace is worth protecting, even when the battle comes to your own doorstep.